Good afternoon, dear delegates, dear colleagues, dear friends, to this session here on Nature Day. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session on upscaling actions to turn the tide on deforestation. This has been organized by the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. My name is Mette Wilkie. I lead the forestry program of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and as such, I'm also the chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. This partnership is a voluntary partnership of some 15 organizations that all have a big program on forest globally. They are individually and jointly working together to help halt deforestation and promote the sustainable management of forests across the world. We will only have this session here in English, I'm afraid, but we do have some virtual speakers, and as you can see, we have some speakers here with me on the podium here today. Firstly, I am delighted to welcome Mr. Zhenmin, who is the UN Under-Secretary General on the Economics and Social Affairs. We have with us as well Dr. Dongyu, the Director General of FAO. Ms. Andersen, sitting right next to me, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. We have Elizabeth Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. Mr. Tony Simons, Executive Director of CIFOR-ICRAF and Director General of ICRAF. And Mr. Ovais Sarmad of the UNFCCC, who will join us a little later. At the Climate Summit in 2019, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called on the world to halt deforestation, restore degraded forests, and change the way we farm. His words have been heard loud and clear. This COP has in many ways been a forest COP. Earlier this week, more than 100 world leaders promised to end deforestation by 2030, pledging more than $20 billion of public and private funds under the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land. And the Collaborative Partnership on Forests and its members have to play its part. Today, leaders of UN agencies and other CPF members will outline their ambition and individual or joint actions to accelerate efforts in turning the tide on deforestation. I'm delighted to first hand the floor to UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Zhenmin, to open the event.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this important dialogue on upscaling actions to turn the tide on deforestation. This dialogue comes at a critical juncture. The international community is facing enormous socio-economic and environmental crises. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries are experiencing immense suffering and disruptions on their path to sustainable development. In 2020, over 120 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. A number of those suffering from hunger increased to over 800 million. Forests, as one of the Earth's most precious resources, are also suffering from unsustainable utilization, exploitation, and degradation. Deforestation continues to be at an alarming rate in several regions. Tremendous pressures are being placed on forests that are contributing to their disappearances. These include climate change, population growth and urbanization, unsustainable land use policies, and agricultural subsidies, as well as increased poverty, inequality, and hunger. Forests have the potential to help address the economic, social, and environmental crisis. Indeed, their role in addressing major global challenges, including in the fight against climate change and deforestation, have been recognized in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the UN Strategic Plan for Forests 2030. Distinguished delegates, we must take concrete steps, not only to turn the tide of deforestation and safeguard our forests, but also to maximize the contribution of forests to addressing climate change, land degradation, natural disasters, water scarcity, poverty, and inequality. This can be done through the following urgent steps. First, halting deforestation can only be achieved through concerted efforts by UN member states, the UN system organizations, and stakeholders. We should accelerate our efforts across the UN system, and in particular, among members of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, to combat deforestation, climate change, and assist in global recovery from the impacts of the COVID-19. Second, it is critical for the UN system and other CPF member organizations to support country efforts to achieve the global forest-related goals and targets, and to integrate them into the operational programs of each CPF member organization. This is an effective means to upscale global efforts, to turn the tide on deforestation and facilitate implementation. Third, new initiatives and partnerships should support achieving the global forest goals and targets. CPF member organizations should also encourage more collaboration with external partners and stakeholders on activities that advance the achievement of the global targets on forests. We welcome the ongoing efforts within CPF to develop a joint initiative on turning the tide on deforestation. This is an important step to enhance synergy and coordination among members of the partnership in tackling deforestation, its drivers, and intensifying factors. Within the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, we are working to explore the best means to support this initiative. To make this joint initiative effective and supportive of the existing global agreements on forests, it should include specific actions to integrate global forest-related goals and targets into the programs of participating organizations, and to support countries in implementing the 2030 Agenda, UN Strategic Plan for Forests, the Paris Agreement, and other relevant agreements and frameworks such as REDD+. Fourth, financing for forests remains well below the level needed to achieve the global goals and targets on forests, especially in developing countries. In the Global Forest Goals Report 2021, published by UNDESA, more than 25% of developing countries reported that inadequate funding hindered their progress towards global forest goals. Under the UN Forum on Forests, the Global Forest Financing Facilitation Network is working to address some finance-related challenges of developing countries, including their access to forest finance. Nevertheless, it is important for the CPF member organizations to make additional efforts to assist countries in this area, including through the newly developed joint initiative. Fifth, UNDESA, along with FAO, UNEP, UNDP, UNFCCC, and other parts of the UN system, should continue to contribute to the working group on turning the tide on deforestation. This has been set up to implement the decisions of the UN Secretary General's Executive Committee. This work should be carried out in close coordination with other relevant initiatives, including the Decade of Action for the SDGs, Climate Action, a Common Approach on Biodiversity. Excellencies, I wish to encourage the collaborative partnership on forests and its member organizations to continue to join forces in efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Forest Goals and other globally agreed goals and targets on forests. As a member and the Secretariat of the partnerships, UNDESA stand ready to support and jointly advance the work of the partnership. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Under Secretary General for DESA. I hear we have some connection problems to our colleagues in Rome. Fortunately, we have a colleague with us here in the room, Eduardo Mansour, who is the Director of the Office for Biodiversity, Climate Change and Environment, who will read the speech on behalf of the Director General of FAO. Please, Eduardo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mette. On behalf of the Director General of FAO, I am pleased to read his speech as they are facing connection problems from Rome at this very moment. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Food and Agriculture Organization leads international efforts to defeat hunger and poverty based on robust science-based evidence. The kind of actions we saw at the beginning of this week in the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, according to FAO's latest Global Forest Resource Assessment, we have lost 420 million hectares of forest since 1990, an area the size of India and Nigeria combined. But to stop deforestation, we need to know more than just the area of forest lost. We need to know where and why it happens and how to act. This can be achieved by combining the latest technological innovations with local expertise on the ground. By using vast digital archives of satellite data and user-friendly tools developed in collaboration with NASA and Google, FAO empowered more than 800 experts from almost 130 countries to produce new information on the drivers of deforestation. Analyzing over 400,000 samples, this global remote sensing survey shows that deforestation continues to be driven mainly by agricultural expansion, conversion of forests to croplands, and livestock grazing. But deforestation can be stopped. We have solutions available. Increasing agri-food productivity to meet the new demands of a growing population and halting deforestation are not mutually exclusive objectives. More than 20 developing countries have already shown that it's possible to do so. Latest data confirms that deforestation has been successfully reduced in South America and in Asia. We need to continue along this path. A green and climate-resilient agriculture that reverses biodiversity loss, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and enhances adaptation and resilience is essential to end poverty and hunger and to address the climate crisis. FAO new strategic framework for 2022-2031 will guide the organization work to transform agri-food systems to be more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable for achieving what we call the 4 betters: better production, better nutrition, a better environment, and a better life for all, leaving no one behind. FAO, together with UNDP, UNEP, along with members, support more than 60 countries to implement strategies to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. FAO is also co-leading the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration together with UNEP, an important opportunity to accelerate and transform innovative ideas into ambitious actions on the ground. The recent UN Food Systems Summit formed a coalition between producers and consumer countries, private companies, and international organizations to deliver deforestation and conversion-free agri-food supply chains. The Collaborative Partnership on Forests, which unites 15 international organizations, is developing a joint initiative to turn the tide on deforestation to complement existing actions and scale up impact. The promising pledges and commitments this week indicate a stronger, coherent movement for real action. Now we must turn words into reality. We must roll up our sleeves and get to plant more trees. This calls for a strategic partnership at all levels. It means working better and more together with governments, the private sector, academic institutions, indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth in an effective, efficient, and coherent manner. Dear colleagues, as we build back better and greener from the pandemic, we need to accelerate our actions to turn the tide on deforestation and scale up our hard-won progress. Our generation must be the one that halts deforestation for a greener future for our future generations. Let's make this happen. Dongyu, Director General, FAO.
Thank you so much, Eduardo Mansour, for stepping in at very, very short notice and delivering that speech on behalf of the FAO Director General, who unfortunately had some connection problems at the last minute. Let me use this opportunity to mention that the results of this global remote sensing survey will be presented in detail on Monday at an event in the EU Pavilion on forest ecosystem trends and innovation, satellite observation, simulations, and firefighting. And in terms of these strategic partnerships, you can find more details of the CPF's work on turning the tide on deforestation in a recently published brochure that is summarizing some of the key flagship programs of the partnership. If you go to the CPF website, you can find this brochure here. Now let me then turn to the panel that we have here on the table. Inger Andersen, as the Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. What are, in your views, the most urgent actions that the CPF members should take to scale up action to halt deforestation and degradation, let's say within the next 5 years?
Well, the thing is that some of us have been journeying this for a long time, and we have good memories. And so in 1992, there was a discussion about forests. That didn't work, and we didn't get a convention in Rio. And in 2014, there was a declaration on forests. And we agreed that we were going to halve deforestation by 2020, and we were going to halt and reverse it by 2030. And we didn't get there. And then, just the other day, we made that same pledge with great fanfare to the whole world. So now, what's going to be different? That's a conversation that we need to have, and we need to have an honesty around it, because otherwise, frankly, we are failing, and we are doing then what those young people in the streets are saying that we are doing. Let us not be those. So therefore, what's going to happen? We have to understand and make sure that we value forests. And valuing forests means what we promised in 2009. Remember? In 2009, what is otherwise called a failed COP15, in my hometown, by the way, and yours too, Copenhagen, there was one thing that was put on the table, which was, by 2020, we shall have $100 billion on the table to ensure that we will be able to support those that need it. And here we are, and we haven't gotten it. So it's time to stop talking, and it's time to live up to these promises that we keep making to one another. Multilateralism is only as good as its weakest link. And so, but the truth is also that multilateralism cannot be that hostage to stronger forces, because here in this COP, the most strong force is those of the indigenous people. The most strong voice is those from the small island states, because they have a moral standing that no one can mess with and no one can dispute. And so when we understand that in this last year we lost about 24 billion tons of soil, when we understand that we lost about 13 million hectares of forests, when we know that UNESCO just the other day issued a report. UNESCO holds a responsibility for managing the world's most precious sites, the ones that we have put up our hands and said, these are World Heritage, these are unique and endemic and special, and we are going to take care of them. And when UNESCO tells us that the 10 protected areas, World Heritage sites, are emitting more carbon than they are storing, friends, the alarm bell should be going off. And so the collaborative platform on forests has to make some major shifts. It's not enough. It's not enough what we are doing. And so what we are very excited about is this new decade of ecosystem restoration. This decade that the Secretariat General, FAO, IUCN, the GEF, ourselves at UNEP, and ICRAF and CIFOR and 1,000 other organizations and individuals are supporting. That is sort of a way that we need to understand. This doesn't get solved in a 3-year project. This doesn't get solved just by money. It gets solved by all of the above. But first and foremost, it gets solved by us understanding that this COP, we have to close the rule book on Paris. We have to make sure that Article 6 gets landed because that will enable carbon markets. And you, Carlos Manuel, you've spoken about the unreasonably low price for carbon, and you probably will again. And so the point here is we need to ensure that these things that are difficult, they are on the most difficult list. That's why we couldn't agree in 1992. That's why we had difficulty in landing 2014. And let us not have the situation that a few years from now, this forest pledge that has just been made is just another also ran. And the way to land it is by landing what we promised back in Paris, which is that we will get working carbon markets. Because if there is a stream of revenue to those people who are taking care of those forests, as well as we get into and understand labeling and trade in a WTO or other contexts with respect to the kind of timber that we need as a society, that it is harvested sustainably, well, then we can begin to get somewhere. So multilateralism, us coming together, is what needs to bring us to the solutions table. But words are easy, deeds is what matter. And so what we need to now have is a global commitment here in this meeting before we leave to close Article 6 and to set up working carbon markets. Not that carbon markets are the panacea, but it becomes one of the pieces in the broader forest puzzle. We need to ensure, of course, that rights are respected. And here I'm very, very pleased that the UN Commission on Human Rights recently passed a decision respecting and highlighting and enforcing the issue of environmental rights, because we are seeing that environmental defenders and often forest defenders are on the front line of harassment and indeed murder. And so that becomes part of the broader conversation. So, you know, that's part of what we have to do the next 5 years.
Thank you, Inger. As most of you know, UNEP has also been the founding member of the UN RED program, which was launched in 2008 jointly with FAO and UNDP. The administrator of UNDP, Achim Steiner, sends his regrets. Unfortunately, he can't be here with us today. But as you can see on this slide that we have up here with a quote from him, he's a keen advocate of that program, which has mobilized some $300 million to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Inger, what has this program and other UNEP initiatives taught us about the kind of incentives that are needed to halt deforestation over and above the carbon market? What else is needed?
It's really important, and this, I want to highlight UN RED because it is a fantastic partnership. It, obviously with our friends at UNDP, our friends at FAO, and many, many others. And it has been really supporting countries, forest-rich countries, in enabling their readying and support for better incentivizing their protection. And really what it has done is that we've been able to understand some of the shifts at the policy level that governments need to enact. Shifting around on the subsidies, obviously. Figuring out, and we will hear that from Carlos Manuel, how to establish payment for ecosystem services, ensuring the rights of indigenous people, and committing to these deforestation-free supply chains that I referenced, and obviously dealing with and ensuring that we are also looking at illegal gold mining. By the way, as I'm saying, I'm double COPing this week because we also have the Minamata COP, which is the COP that deals with phasing out mercury in the environment and in manufacturing. And clearly, gold mining is a significant issue, and the use of mercury in gold mining is a significant health dimension. So the UN RED is a tried and tested, if I can say so, vehicle through which we have been able to support member states and communities. And it's quite remarkable that this program has had such resilience and such uptake. I'd say that at this point, significant delivery has been made. A lot of lessons have been learned, many mistakes as it is, but it has, but each of these we've sort of said, okay, so this is how we can secure rights of indigenous and local communities, indigenous people and local communities. This is a better way to deal with the gender dimension. How do we ensure that money flows that will eventually come are going in the right direction and not in, frankly, the wrong, pertaining to governance and anti-corruption measures. And each of these have been important. These are difficult and complex things, and we cannot pretend that they can be solved with a flick of a finger. But I think the fact that agencies of the United Nations have sort of stood here and been willing to be on the front line with massive support from donors has been very critical. And certainly, there are lots of lessons that we're taking from these into the decade of ecosystem restoration, which FAO, under your leadership in FAO, and a great team in my shop too, are delivering together with many, many, many others. It's about crowding in, but we're very pleased to be working with FAO on the decade. And taking that longer view that we did with UN RED, and that we are doing now with the decade on ecosystem restoration is necessary, because these things are complex. But when we meet at the end of the decade, let it be said then that we landed on the targets of that we have heard now in the pledge of halting deforestation, of cutting it in half and halting it by 2030. I think that is where we have to get to, and we just cannot continue to kick that can down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inger. The agreement that we had on RED Plus under the UNFCCC was clearly a major milestone and has helped unlock much needed finance to countries that have demonstrated the ability to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So let's stay a little bit on the finance topic and turn to you, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who is the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. What and which enabling environments have to be put in place to halt that deforestation and to stop the conversion from agriculture commodities, which we know is the main driver of deforestation?
Well, thank you so much, Mette and dear colleagues, for the invitation to this CPF event. Jeff will continue to be a good partner of this initiative. I was delighted to see 100 head of states and leaders to commit to zero deforestation by 2030, because I was the Minister of Environment in 2005, that jointly with Minister Hadi from Papua in 2005, in COP11 in Montreal, we convinced the parties to begin a conversation on forest conservation. Probably most of participants into this COP doesn't realize that for the half of the life of this convention, forest was not seen as part of the solution or even part of the problem. Even though IPCC in 2003 brought the first report on emissions generated by land use change. And two tiny countries, Costa Rica and Papua New Guinea, lead a process, and we felt that we did a breakthrough in COP11, 2005 in Montreal. It was a little bit colder than now, where the agreement was, let's begin talking let's begin a conversation on forest, 2005. So I feel super, super excited. Now, even though it took us more than 15 years to have 100 world leaders commit to 2030, but also, as Inger said, in 2014, the fourth declaration, but also, Inger, in 2010, in the Aichi target number 5, CBD, says that by 2020, we will halt deforestation and get close to zero, and we will increase degraded landscape up to 15% if we fail. Why we fail? Because we don't have public and private investment aligned with the Paris Agreement and with the Aichi targets. Today, humans invest 142 times more financial resources in activities that generate deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation, as simple as that. As irrational as it may sound. And that is no more, no less than the highest example of policy incoherence at the planetary level. If we are not able to align public and private investments within the Paris Agreement and the new CBD framework and our commitment for land conservation, land restoration, land neutrality, we'll never achieve our goals to do that. So let's stop investing in killing the planet and destroying nature. As simple as that, it is complex. Because today, it makes more economic sense to continue land use changing with a quick short-term profit rather than protecting forests, because the market is not there. We got a huge, huge market failure, and this is what we brought up in 2005 in COP11 when we said that if we don't pay the cost of opportunity of cattle ranching and subsistence agriculture to owners of forests, the land will be clear, because people need an income, need to eat. And if forest is not an option for their own development, they will take a very simple cost-benefit analysis and they will change it. And that's why out of that agreement in COP11, we began then in the Bali, COP12, we agree on what we call RED, and then in the following COP, we put the plus to RED, because before RED plus, there was RED, which was basically rewarding those countries with high deforestation and little interest in forest conservation. The plus came to include other elements which are there. So some lessons. The first one, the financial economic lesson. We need to really understand how do we phase out all those negative investment subsidies and perverse incentives and move into positive one, which is no less, no more than implementing Aichi target number 3. Then we need to really design global, which is the top-down financial mechanism for payment for carbon services. We had RED Plus, but RED Plus hasn't gone from where it is, very low level, low scale, and at this point is paying $5, $7 per ton of carbon. I had the pleasure, Mette, Inge, and Tony, I had the pleasure to participate in the first ever forest carbon transaction, 1997, Costa Rica and Norway. We sold 400,000 tons of carbon to Norway. At what price? $10, 1997. And today, if you go to the different facilities, they pay you $5, $7. We haven't understood that we need to pay the cost of opportunity of doing the wrong things in the landscapes. And I don't get it. I don't get it why a ton of carbon of a cement plant in Switzerland, the value is $90 per ton, and a ton of carbon in Gabon or in Nicaragua, the value is $5 to $7. So we need to fix that problem. The other element that we need to address is the institutional failure. This is the market failure, the institutional failure. We got institutions as having proved that they can really manage the landscapes in an integrated manner. And I don't want to be in the shoes of Mr. Tony Simmons, who has to work in the interface of forest conservation and food systems, because this is the center of what we need to understand. We created agencies to solve food system, nature conservation that works on silos in the same landscape with the same stakeholders, and they don't collaborate, they don't complement, they don't plan together. As a matter of fact, 80% of deforestation are a product of policies that are coming from ministries of agriculture. We need to understand that we will never achieve the 2030 zero deforestation with the same institutional framework that in first place has created the problem that we want to solve today. So we need to be innovative and realize that it won't be until we redesign the public agencies that they work at the level of the landscape, at the seascape, that we will have a good opportunity to achieve these goals, to restore, to feed people, to make more resilient landscapes, and to mitigate to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that inspiring tale of what has happened in the past and what needs to be done, and throwing the challenge, the gauntlet, to Tony. Tony, do you want to pick up on this?
Indeed. Thank you, Mette. Thank you also, Carlos, Inga. Deforestation, forestry, land use, agriculture, feeding ourselves, protecting biodiversity, having ecosystems, social inclusion are so important and so interwoven and so complex. And so we can't just take deforestation in isolation, as many of the speakers have said. Article 5 is that wonderful article in the Paris Agreement that says we're going to conserve and we're going to protect forest. And we have a lot of very neutral language around it. Mitigation, adaptation. You know, we don't feel uncomfortable, you know, versus a whole lot of terms we see in the media and social media today. It's neutral, it's easy. It's a lifestyle choice. All of us, every single human on this planet, we have our name on 100 tons of carbon that is in the atmosphere. 100 tons. And every year, we increase that. Some people are increasing it by 0.5 ton a year. Others have an individual contribution above 40 tons a year. But it's all a global dustbin. It's something we can live with. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's actually life and death. When trees and forests emerged on our planet 380 million years ago, CO2 concentrations were 4,000 parts per million, 10 times what they are today. Temperature, 10 degrees hotter than it is today. And it was trees that made this planet habitable for most animals, and indeed, humans ourselves. And the destruction of trees is going to lead to the destruction of us. Yes, it's life and death. Mitigation. Well, in law, mitigation means something we can take into account to reduce your sentence. You're still guilty, okay? But we'll recognize some extenuating circumstances. It's not mitigation. This is aggravation. Aggravated actions. We're all making the problem worse. And what are we going to do about it? We have to accept it. It's easy to pledge 2030, 2050. You know, I could promise my relatives, I'll stop drinking by 2050 and I'll halve my alcohol consumption by 2030. It might still lead to an underlying problem, you know? We've got to have much shorter time frames and understand these economic levers. And it was Inga and Carlos who both reminded us there's a huge difference between price and cost and value, and we confuse them all. And when we just bring it down to monetary value, then we leave out a lot of the cultural side, the social side, the indigenous people. Indigenous people are about 5% of our world, of our total population, and yet they manage about 20% of our land. but we don't give them rights, we don't give them access, we don't give them control over many of those resources. And that needs to change, because they are the main custodians of our forest, of those wonderful resources that are so full of all of that richness, biodiversity, and ecological functioning. Mette, you're a forester. Avoided deforestation. I mean, it's another word for avoided responsibility. Since Bali 2007, COP13, we've said, do you know what? What we're going to do is we're going to, let's reward the bad actors for being a little bit less bad, okay? So if you're half as bad as you were last year, we're going to reward you. But the communities and the countries and the individuals that are good, you'll get another pat on the back. There's no incentive, there's no reward. We don't factor in those opportunity costs. We don't have a real value to those wonderful assets and resources which are called forests. We've had 26 attempts, COP26, and we've got these wonderful and new nationally determined contributions. Countries alone are not going to do it. It's going to be that combination of nationally determined contributions, corporately determined contributions, community-led contributions, and individual contributions. Each of us, as we seek to help be global stewards. We're all indigenous. We're indigenous to the planet Earth. That's where we all come from. We may have different languages. We may have different belief systems. We may have different knowledge systems. But we've got to come together to solve something that is a huge global benefit to us, but it also needs to be that global responsibility. And as a member of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, we're delighted as CIFOR-ICRAF to contribute a lot to that knowledge base, that scientific base. But as fantastic as the data and the analyses and the social, the technical, the policy solutions that we have, these knowledge products largely sit on the shelf. We have 28,000 web pages on our website. Go and check it out. It's this enormous warehouse of knowledge. But we've been deficient in not turning it into a knowledge service, something that countries, that companies and others can use to take that needed action on deforestation, to take that landscape approach of looking at the agriculture, the wetlands, the deserts, the forests, the community areas, the plantations. Growing trees and using that wood and timber for construction is fantastic. So if we don't want a glass, a steel, a plastic, a metal future, we've got to protect and restore and use those forests in a more sustainable way, all of us.
Thank you so much, Tony, and for bringing this into some more broader areas of conversation here on what it is that we need to do and why it's so important that we look to these fantastic ecosystems that we have, including forest. We don't have Elizabeth Mrema with us here today, but she has recorded a short statement for us to talk a little bit about why it's also so important that we halt deforestation for the purpose of conserving the biodiversity. So if we can have the video from Elizabeth Mrema, please.
Dear colleagues, greetings to you all. It is my pleasure to join you today on this high-level dialogue of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. My intervention today will speak mostly to framing the question on how to fully use the massive mitigation and adaptation potential of forests as envisaged under Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. I will deliver my response through 4 main points. Firstly, in order to turn the tide and fully realize the climate potential of forests, we need to take ecosystem restoration to an unprecedented scale at an unprecedented pace. This prospect has been boosted by the UN General Assembly decision to declare 2021 to 2030 as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Together with the reduction of deforestation and degradation, It is the single biggest action we can take to bring us closer to meeting both the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the goals of the upcoming post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It is estimated that the restoration of ecosystems, and mostly prominently forests, can deliver 1/3 of the climate mitigation needed by 2030, while also preventing 2/3 of projected global species extinction. Draft 1 of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework foresees an increase of at least 15% in the area, connectivity, and integrity of natural ecosystems in order to reduce tenfold the rates of species extinction. Those outcomes are for 2050, but they are similar to the discussions under the Paris Agreement. We know that in order to get there, it is not enough to promise things far into the future, when we know that what happens in the next decade will have a critical impact in the short and medium term, leading us to the future sustainability. Only 3% of global climate finance is estimated to be spent on nature-based solutions. That number needs to rise. We need to ensure that parties to both conventions, especially developing country parties, understand the connection between the climate and biodiversity crises. Secondly, we need to become smarter about where we restore and how we restore forests. Recent studies have shown that with proper planning and implementation, we can reconcile agricultural production alongside substantial increases in the area and quality of natural ecosystems. Thirdly, what makes the voice of the Convention on Biological Diversity most distinct amongst the collaborative partnership on forest members is the fact that, from the standpoint of biodiversity, not all forests are equal. The best restoration project in the world will never manage to recreate the complexity, structure, and biodiversity of forests that have grown naturally over centuries. In our fight against deforestation, we must do everything in our power to preserve the last fragments of primary forests. Finally, a word of caution. Drawing on the Kunming Declaration, adopted at the high-level segment of the first part of the Convention's Conference of the Parties, 15, and to quote the Kunming Declaration, ecosystem-based approaches, including forest restoration and reduced deforestation and degradation, do not replace the priority actions needed to urgently reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. In other words, the potential of forests and other ecosystems to sequester carbon is not an excuse to relax our efforts to reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels. I extend my best wishes to all my co-speakers, wishing everyone a fruitful discussions and a successful outcome of the 26th Conference of the Parties for Climate on Forest and beyond, as these outcomes will equally co-benefit biodiversity conservation and restoration. Thank you.
And thank you to Elizabeth Mrema to highlighting those linkages that we have. Both she and Inga spoke about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which runs from 2021 to 2030. And the aim of that is to prevent, halt, and reverse ecosystem degradation worldwide. And it's not just because of climate, not just because of biodiversity. It is also to help us halt the degradation and the desertification that are happening across the world in many of the driest areas. And of course, it is as well to help improve the livelihoods of rural people. So, Tony, we heard a bit about indigenous peoples, and you talked about how much of the land that they are managing, they're stewards of. We also know that the actions that are taken can have different impact on different people and sections of the society. How do we really look at, in a way that we can reduce that inequity and inequality that we have when we're dealing with forests and, in your case as well, agriculture?
An incredibly important topic, Mette, and thanks for highlighting the double dimension of inequity and inequality. Inequality is an unfair distribution of resources. Inequality is an uneven distribution of resources. Inequity is an unfair distribution of those resources. And as we address those two dimensions in our world, inequality gives rise to conflict, envy, disputes, difficulties, differential rewards. Inequity and the indigenous peoples have been treated often in many inequitous ways, and not by necessarily their neighbors or their governments or other groups, but by the globe. We don't pay enough attention to these stewards of biodiversity, these people whose belief systems and knowledge systems have benefited us tremendously in the provisioning and management of those landscapes. So if you like, a duty of care economy, a land stewardship economy is something that we need to progress to reward and recognize and integrate the roles of those indigenous people in managing our landscapes and our collective global resources together. So in some of the countries we work, it is difficult. There's often a predominance of government-controlled resources. Governments are not perhaps able already or haven't thought through all of the mechanisms to assign, reward, allocate land and title deeds and adjudication. However, many are making tremendous strides in giving land use rights. Côte d'Ivoire, as an example, recognized that the classified forests, the forêts classées in their country, were degrading, and that there was a huge difficulty of it. They were not ready to give that land over because of the difficulties of a lot of the communities there, perhaps not being originally from that area, but more not the ownership rights, but the use rights. Renewable 30-year leases, conditional leases, so those forests have to be managed in a way that retains tree cover, promotes social equity, is diverse in terms of the enterprises underway there. A country that we signed CIFOR-ICRAF signed a new host country agreement with this week, Mette, is Papua New Guinea, where the tremendous, it is the country in the world with only 0.1, so that's 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. They have 3/10 of 1% of the world's land, and yet they have 7% of the world's biodiversity. They're the most linguistically diverse country in the world, 860 different languages. And when you start to look at their landscapes, they have different tribes, different clans, and different communities. And that complexity, that social complexity, is a huge opportunity, but also a huge risk if we come in with overly simplistic solutions. And so seeking to understand those social structures and reinforce them, and to have precautionary principles around making sure that these market-based incentives don't create extra conflict or inequity or inequality is vitally important. And so this is not just the Forest COP, it's the Forest and Peoples COP. It's trying to bring the social dimension into landscape management, into land stewardship, into that duty of care economy, recognizing economy comes from the Greek word of home, oikos.
Thank you, Tony. We've heard a lot of discussions here today on how complex it is. Halting deforestation is not an easy thing to do. I'm really pleased that we have a number of organizations with different entry points and different skill sets that can help countries and other stakeholders move forward in their aims to halt deforestation. In the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, we have the UN agencies, we have the conventions, we have the finance institutions such as the Global Environment Facility, we have the academia research science-based organizations, CIFOR-ICRAF, the UFRO, and we have the organizations that are dealing with what is happening on the ground in terms of biodiversity. We have CITES secretariats and we have the IUCN. All of these organizations have now decided to come together to look at what it is that we have to offer in terms of flagship programs that are already existing to help countries and stakeholders halt deforestation. But we've also decided, and we started working on that in January this year, to come up with a joint initiative that looks at what are the gaps, what else needs to be done, and what can we do to fill those gaps and to help create a better synergy among the actions that we have. Having 15 organizations working in different countries, of course, means that perhaps in one part of Indonesia, we have CIFOR working on one topic, and in another part of the same country, we have another agency working on another. We want to look at how we can build together that synergy so that we can help scaling that up. So you will hear much more about that in the weeks and months to come. Now today, we are also in the process, we know here within COP, we had hoped to have Patricia Espinosa with us, but I know that they are closing Substa as we speak. And I'm hoping very much that we will have her deputy here, Ovais Samrat, Deputy Executive Secretary on UNFCCC, to give us a few remarks. Let's see if he's online already. We have a small technical problem with him as well, as it turns out. In that case, what I would like to say is simply to say a huge thank you for being with us here today. I want to thank the speakers that have been with us. As you know, there are many things going on, so a couple of them would have had to leave a little bit earlier. I want to thank the participants. I want to thank the technical staff here. I want to wish everybody a success for the remaining of COP26 and for the rest of this Nature Day at COP26. Thank you very much for today.